Welcome back to Heightscast, the podcast of the Heights School. This is Rich Moss with you from the campus of the Heights in Potomac, Maryland. We are here to talk about the education and the formation of young men fully alive in the liberal arts tradition. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you for continuing to share our mission and our vision of education with your friends. We are profoundly grateful. Thanks again for listening. Thanks for sharing us with those who value what we value. Before we get to today's conversation, just a couple of quick announcements. The Convivium for 2025 is sold out. There are other opportunities to get to know the Heights and what we do. The Teaching Boys conferences coming up in January and in May are going to be awesome. Learn more about those at heightsforum.org. We also have the upcoming Fathers Conference, November 1. The theme is Father as Provider. We'd love to see you there. So do check out heightsforum.org to learn more about both of those events. But now getting to the topic of today's conversation, I am delighted to welcome to Heightscast Professor Melissa Moschella. Professor Moschella is the professor of the practice of philosophy at the University of Notre Dame at their McGrath Institute for Church Life. She also serves as a distinguished fellow in the Center for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory University School of Law and as an adjunct professor of medical ethics at Columbia University's Medical School. She received her undergraduate degree from Harvard, her PhD from Princeton, and she taught as a professor of philosophy at the Catholic University of America in D.C. for more than 10 years before her recent appointment at Notre Dame. Professor Moschella is also the author of two books, To Whom Do Children Belong? Parental Rights, Civic Education, and Children's Autonomy in 2016, and then more recently, Ethics, Politics, and Natural Law, Principles for Human Flourishing, released earlier this year. And she has another book on Catholic social teaching in the works from CUA Press. So obviously a scholar who's written a lot and thought a lot about things that we really value here at the Heights. Professor Moschella, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you on.
It's a pleasure to be on the podcast. I've heard wonderful things about the Heights, so very happy to join you in this conversation.
Wonderful. Well, thanks for being here for it. And before we get into this, it's interesting because this podcast is not, it's not about policy. Nor is it necessarily kind of a theology podcast, although I see both of those as very important concentric circles, and there's a gap right where they meet, and that's kind of where the Heights lives in this space where we have children and we're trying to educate them within the context of this wonderful country that we live in. So I think we are going to mention a lot of things that we're not going to be able to exhaust because you've written about a lot of very complicated, beautiful things, but we're not going to be able to do them all justice. So as I was thinking about this morning, it's kind of like, it's almost like we're gonna pop up the hood and look under the hood of the car. We know we're going somewhere, but let's actually take a look, and we're not necessarily going to take apart any of the pieces, but we're just going to see the different pieces and how they're working. And if folks are interested in learning more, your books are an amazing place for them to go. But we are going to talk about parental rights in natural and constitutional law. So I think right off the bat, maybe we can just begin with this concept of rights, because many of us, I think when we hear we say, I think many of us say, especially as Americans, I have a right to this, or I have a right to that other thing. Oftentimes, I think what we tend to be saying is, I feel very strongly that this is a thing, this is an action that I should be allowed to do. And I wonder if we should think more about that, because then really what you feel you ought to be allowed to do is kind of what becomes what's debated. Could you please explain to us more about the natural law tradition and how it relates to rights? Because then I think this helps us better understand the concept of parental rights.
Yeah, that's a great question. And you're absolutely right that very often this kind of rights talk gets just kind of thrown around. I have a right to this, I have a right to that. And it often is, sometimes little more than, I really want this and I really want you to let me have it, or I really want you to give it to me. And there isn't a lot of clarity about what the grounding of the right is, or who might have the duty to make sure that the right is respected, or the thing that the right is who has the responsibility to provide that for you. And those are all very complicated questions. So I think, to think more clearly and deeply about rights, we need to recognize that rights are always, true rights are always related to duties in various ways. So for there to be a true right, there also has to be a true duty on the part of others to do the thing, right, or provide the thing that you have a right to, right? So to take a kind of, and those duties tend to correspond to basic moral principles, right? So any claim about rights, it's not like you invoke rights talk and then it's just like magical, that this thing now appears that didn't exist before. Instead, any claim about rights that is genuine could be translated into a claim about the requirements of justice, considered from the perspective of the beneficiary of those requirements. So, just to take a kind of basic example, you might say, we all have a right not to be murdered. Right? That's a negative right, a right to be free from some kind of negative conduct or harm on the part of somebody else. And that just corresponds to the basic moral principle that, intentional killing of the innocent is always wrong. So everybody has a duty of justice to refrain from murdering everybody else. And that means that on the flip side, the beneficiary of that is that everybody has a right not to be murdered, right? And that's a kind of easy case, but you could also talk about positive rights to be given things, right? You could think about rights to the basic provision of your basic needs, or healthcare, or education for children. Those are more complicated though, because then you have to say, well, who's the duty holder there? Who has the duty to provide you with your basic needs or your education or whatever it might be? And that's where things get tricky, because sometimes immediately people jump from, well, I have a right to this. It does correspond to something that's genuinely good for me. But they often jump straight from that to, and then the government has the obligation to provide it. But that's too quick, right? If you think about, well, who has the obligation to provide me with food? Well, frankly, it's primarily me, right? Because I'm an adult of, sound mind and body, and I can work to support myself, me, together with my husband, who also has special duties to me, because of the marital commitments that we have to each other. Or if you think about who has the duty to provide children with education, well, it's primarily their parents, because of the special relationship that they have to those children and the special obligations that they have. And then there are kind of secondary duties, what we might call subsidiary duties to help the primary duty holder in cases where that primary duty holder is not able to fully meet that need or provide for that right. And that's where things like the larger community or even the state might come in. But that, as I said, is a kind of secondary thing and subsidiary, aimed to help the primary duty holder and kind of fill in the cracks where the primary duty holder might not be fulfilling their responsibilities. But it's not meant to replace or kind of usurp the primary role that the primary duty holder has.
Great. That's helpful, because again, just the discourse can often be, and I think all of us fall prey to this, right? Where we say, I have this right because I feel, I mean, you might not say it, but I think you feel it, and that affects how you think about it. And this idea of rights being grounded in obligations or duties, it gives us something that we can kind of say, okay, I know that sometimes I have this bias by virtue of my humanity, but let's ground this thought or this feeling in something more objective, and it's really helpful. So how does this then relate to the natural law? Because even then you could say, okay, well, rights, justice, and obligation, it's the same thing. How do we ground our sense of duty or obligation in something deeper about reality? What's the link between me as a human person with a duty or a right, both the same thing, kind of flip sides of the same card? What's the link between that and reality? And is that where natural law steps in? And kind of how do you then derive how we ought to act, what our duties are, what our obligations are from this natural law that you've written about so beautifully?
Right. So the natural law is just a set of ethical and moral principles that we can know through reason, right? Without the added help that you might get from divine revelation. And these moral principles are principles that ultimately guide us toward a flourishing life, both for ourselves as individuals and for, the whole human community. So it's natural in both of those senses. It's natural in the sense that it's moral principles accessible to natural reason, apart from the additional information that we might get from supernatural revelation, from faith. And it's natural in the sense that it's a law, a set of principles and rules, guidelines that are ultimately aimed at the perfection of our nature, right? The full flourishing of human nature, again, both for individuals and for the whole human community. So, the most basic set of principles of natural law are really guiding us toward those objective goods that fulfill the different aspects of our nature, right? So you can think about, the good of life, which is the life and health, which is the fulfillment of the bodily aspect of our nature, or knowledge and truth, right? The fulfillment of the capacity that we have to know, right? Because we're not just bodies, we also have minds, we have a capacity for knowledge. Then there's, a social dimension of our nature where we need relationship. We have a capacity to be in genuine relationship with other people. And the fulfillment of that is, the good of community, the good of friendship, and in a very special way, also the good of marriage that then relates to family and procreation and the raising of children, in addition to the other dimensions of friendship. The good of personal integrity, of virtue, right? The good of the harmony among the various parts of yourself that is most fulfilled in the development of virtues, and the good of religion, or harmony with the transcendent source of existence and meaning, harmony with God, right? Which is then concretized in particular religious practices, but can be understood even without divine revelation as simply a natural good, that we're all inclined to ask these deep questions about meaning and ultimate purpose, and then be in harmony with the source of all of that if we discover that there is one. So that's just a kind of basic set of the goods that we can know through natural reason that we're directed toward. And then there are moral principles that guide our pursuit of those goods, right? So I can act to promote my life or my health or to promote knowledge, but I might act for those things in ways that are not, in fact, morally good. I could seek knowledge by, stealing a library book or something like that, right? So I'd be seeking a genuine good, but I'd be seeking it in a way that is wrong. Why is it wrong? Well, in that case, it's wrong because it's unfair, right? Stealing is wrong because it violates a basic, in a sense, golden rule principle, right? That property is something that serves everybody, and so to be fair, we have to respect other people's property just as we would want them to respect ours, because that's important for everybody to be able to lead their lives well. And then you can kind of make similar arguments about other moral norms that guide our choices in terms of which goods we pursue at any given moment, right? Because at any given moment I could pursue a whole array of different goods, and then also who we prioritize, right? Because all of our choices are also related to, who am I trying, whose fulfillment am I trying to promote here? Who am I trying to benefit with this action? Myself, my family, my friends, a stranger? Well, how do you make those judgment calls about which person to dedicate your time and energy and resources to helping, given the limited time and energy that we all have? And so moral norms, moral rules are really all about providing those guidelines for these choices that we have to make.
Wonderful. So yeah, I as a whole, I mean, gosh, you could spend a lifetime, and I guess in some ways you are studying these questions of like, right. How do you, because what does it mean to be me, and what are the obligations that places on us as human persons with this end that we have? It's awesome, and how do you derive that through the use of your reason? Brilliant. We will set that aside in part, but just shift attention towards, okay, these parental rights. So how does the concept of parental rights, the right to form, here at the Heights, we say that we are primary educators as parents. And I know we're not the only ones who say that, but that's very important to us. So the parents are the primary educators. That's more than just a sentiment. I think it's something that comes from the tradition you're describing. Can you help us see how that tradition leads to this conclusion about our duty as parents?
Right. So, when we're thinking about parental rights, I think it's a special type of right in the sense that it's a right that protects a sphere of decision-making authority. Right. So when you think about when you're claiming, parents have rights as primary educators, basically what you're saying is parents are the ones who have the authority to make decisions about how best to raise and educate their children. And, except in cases where they're clearly abusing their authority or failing in obvious and serious ways to fulfill their responsibilities, we should respect their authority, their decisions about how best to raise and educate their children, even if we might disagree, even if we might think that there's a better way, right? So parental rights protect the authority of parents in the sphere of child rearing and the education of children. And then you might ask, well, why do parents have this authority, right? Why should we say, well, even if I disagree with so-and-so about how, the decisions that he or she is making about raising their children, why should I not intervene? Or if I'm the state, right? Why should I allow parents to make their own decisions about how to raise their children, even if I, as the state, think, well, I think I know better about the best pedagogical methods or the best content that we should be teaching in the schools? Why not simply have the state have total control over this, with parents, basically having to bow to whatever the state's ultimate judgments are on these matters? Why do we think that parents have authority here? Again, presuming that they're making these judgments in good faith and that they're not abusing or neglecting their children. And I think that the natural law argument is, well, parental authority is the way in which parents are exercising the natural responsibility that they have to care for their children. Because given the immaturity of children, caring for children requires making the decisions on their behalf that the children are not yet mature enough to make for themselves. And so that obligation comes from the deep ties that parents have with their children, right? If you think about, what is it, who has the strongest relationship to children, the deepest relationship to them? Well, it's their parents, right? Nobody knows a child like the child's parents. Nobody is naturally as motivated to want the good of the child than the child's parent. Without parents, of course, there would be no children at all, right? I mean, the state doesn't bring children into the world. It's the parents that bring children into the world. And that relationship starts at the biological level, where you say, the very identity and existence of the child it comes from and is based on the child's relationship to the parents. And so it's because of that unique relationship that parents both have that special obligation, but also this is something that corresponds to the needs of children, because that special relationship that parents have to their children means that they are in some respects irreplaceable to their children, right? It matters to the child, who is raising them, who is loving them. It's not just that, any social worker can step in and love my child, in my place. Well, that's obviously not the case. The personal relationship means that personal love and care matters to the child, and that personal love and care puts the parent in a place to be able to educate that others simply don't have, because they don't have that trusting relationship that comes from having cared for the child, and that deep knowledge of the child from having cared for the child over time, since birth, typically.
Yeah, no, totally. And here it's interesting. I love how just rooted in nature. Not only natural law generally, but your book also, it's very like it's enfleshed. There's sort of like this. We're not just kind of like philosophizing in the abstract. There are just real practical implications to the fact that children have parents, and you surround that also in some really interesting stories about, children who were switched at birth or other things along those lines, where there are real physiological, psychological implications to this notion of parenthood. So again, I really just encourage people to read the book, To Whom Do Children Belong? And in that spirit, it's beautiful to highlight Aquinas's. What I learned from reading your book, this idea of almost the family being a womb of sorts, a continuation of the womb of the child. Maybe you could share that with listeners. I think it's a great image.
Right. Yeah. So Aquinas has this wonderfully evocative image when he talks about parental rights, and he says that that parents do have this natural authority over their children. Because the family is kind of like an extension of the mother's womb, right? And so just as the appropriate place for the child to be, the best place for the child to be prior to birth is within the mother's womb, the best place for the child to then receive the appropriate care and guidance and education needed from birth until adulthood, until reaching kind of full human maturity, is within the spiritual womb of the family, right? Which you can think of as a kind of sphere of decision-making authority, within which parents, again, are the appropriate ones to make the decisions about what is in the best interests of their children. Beautiful.
And I think we should probably move on. I'd love at some point maybe to hear more about how this tradition of parental rights, parental authority enters the American experience. I think there's a lot to speak of there because, you can't just say, well, I think sometimes we think the natural laws, that's what the philosophers wrote about and the older folks in Greece. And so that's what we should do now. But it's like there were different models of parenting in Greece. I think you highlighted somewhere the Spartans and, taking kids away from their parents at age 7 or 8. We don't do that here. And thanks be to God. So it is interesting just to see how all these ideas enter our own experience here in the United States. But maybe could you introduce the concept then? Okay, so you have this child who has, in a way, a right, a need of this non-transferable care from his parents, right? Only parents can care for their children in this particular way. The child has that need. The parents have this right/duty to exercise authority over their child in this way. And so you've got this little micro system. And that exists within, of course, the broader context of the state. So can you speak about that relationship of what is the kind of the state right or the state duty with respect to parental rights? How's it similar? How's it different?
Right. So as you said, right, there have been different models of this, right? Plato, famously or infamously, depending on your view, in the Republic, talked about raising children in common and having the state kind of educate them in line with the state's values, right? And most of us, recoil at that sort of idea, or
most of the time,
Lois Lowry's The Giver, right, where that you have women assigned to be birth mothers who then, give birth, have the special role in the society of giving birth to the children. But then those children are then assigned, to parents who kind of apply for a parenting license from the state. And then they get assigned a child, kind of at random by the state. No biological connection, no natural connection to the child. And the child is separated from the birth mother. These sorts of things we consider dystopian, right? And the reason for that is, I think some of the natural law arguments we talked about before about the importance of that connection between parent and child. And so, that has been taken up in the common law tradition in the United States, beginning from the colonies. We took this common law tradition from England, and that the English common law tradition itself is kind of built on the natural law tradition, Aquinas, but then later kind of early modern natural law thinkers like Locke had a similar view about the natural rights and obligations in terms of parents and children, and that the state's role in that is secondary. So what we're seeing in the American tradition is really just a kind of continuation of the kind of argument that you find in Aquinas, but via the English common law tradition. And so the role of the state here is, I think, subsidiary is the best word for that. And subsidiary comes from the Latin word subsidium, which is it has a kind of double meaning of both assisting and secondary, right? So the role of the state is to assist parents in fulfilling the educational duties that are theirs by nature, and that role is secondary. So it should be exercised in a way that respects the primary child-rearing authority of parents, except in cases of genuine abuse or neglect, where parents really are, simply failing to fulfill their responsibilities in a serious way. And the state also has, I think, a legitimate concern to ensure that the way parents are raising their children provides them with a kind of minimal knowledge and skills that they need for the children to become law-abiding, productive citizens as adults. So it's reasonable for the state to, have, for instance, compulsory education laws that say, okay, well, children need to receive an education at least up to this basic minimum level that is deemed necessary for, law-abiding, productive citizenship in the future, and that the state, because education is good not just for the individual child, but ultimately to have an educated citizenry is important for society as a whole. Then it also makes sense that we think of education in part as a public good, such that the state would subsidize education, would set up schools to make sure that everybody, even the poorest among us, have opportunities for their children to be educated. But all of that should be seen as subsidiary, that is secondary to the parents' role and helping the parents fulfill their educational task. I think things go wrong when we start to see the state, or the state starts to see itself as the primary agent of education, at least when it comes to formal school.
That's great. Yeah, that's helpful. And so this is one of those moments where we're going to pop the hood in the car, we're going to look down, and we're going to just see all the different parts. And we're not like I'm not an expert mechanic, but I want to know what that thing is right there that's spinning around real fast and taking us somewhere. Can you speak to the philosophy of John Rawls? And he seemed like a character in, again, the book To Whom Do Children Belong, who has then shaped subsequent thinkers in ways that have kind of shifted this balance between the state and the family, where, no longer is the family primary, but it's almost like the state has a primary-ish duty to form these good citizens. And I kept seeing the name Rawls come up again and again and again. Can you share with us, just tell us more about him and how he's affected? Because I think we read the newspaper, we see the court cases and all the rest of it, but we don't often think about, okay, why is this happening? And it seems like some of it might come from this type of thinking. And so I'd just love to be introduced to him, if you don't mind.
Right. So John Rawls was a very prominent and influential political philosopher who died not too long ago. So, very recent contemporary philosopher. And his work is primarily about justice and the conditions for having a liberal democratic society that is just, given what he calls the fact of reasonable pluralism, given the fact that we live in a diverse society where people have, different views, different ultimate commitments in terms of their vision of the good life, their answers to kind of ultimate questions about existence and meaning. And, since we don't agree on all those things, and it's not reasonable to expect that we will agree on all these things, well, what's required for us to live together in a way that is just and that fully respects democratic participation and the voice of everybody in society. And so there's complicated elements of this philosophy that I'm not gonna get into. I don't want to get into
Yes,
too much
absolutely.
of the weeds here, but when it comes to education, he basically has the view, and those who write more directly about education, who are kind of following in his philosophy, people like Amy Gutman, Stephen Macedo, even Callan. These are some of the kind of prominent people who write in this space. They talk about the idea. Gutman, in particular, has a book called Democratic Education, and she talks about, well, what's required for the education of future citizens, and because of this kind of underlying Rawlsian framework that they're working with, they have a very strong notion of what is required to educate children to be good democratic citizens. So what they mean by that is probably very different from what you and I or the average person on the street means by a good democratic citizen. What they mean basically is somebody who's effectively been educated in Rawlsian philosophy, right? Somebody who thinks that comprehensive views about the good life, for instance, your religious beliefs, for instance, that those basically need to stay out of your public political life, right? So when you're voting on this view, you should only be voting on the basis of what Rawls calls public reasons, the sorts of reasons that everybody, regardless of their particular religious beliefs or ultimate commitments in life, could understand, right? And so when you go to the ballot box, you shouldn't be voting on the basis of a particular religious belief that a fellow citizen of a different religious tradition couldn't, at least in principle, understand. And so those kind of restrictions on the behavior of citizens are the kinds of things that people like Amy Gutman think children need to be educated into. And so the argument is that they need to have a kind of education that, for instance, exposes them sympathetically to different ways of life, that exposes them to criticisms of their own ultimate beliefs or faith tradition, so that they can appreciate the reasonable pluralism of society, so that they can learn to kind of bracket these comprehensive beliefs, these religious beliefs, when they go into public political life in order to be good Rawlsian citizens. And they think that this is so important that the state should be able to enforce this kind of, say, diversity education, and require that all children have it, even if a parent is objecting, even if a parent says, look, on the basis of my own religious tradition, I teach my child to respect everybody, regardless of whether we agree with their beliefs or not. But I don't want my child, especially at a young age, to be, confused by, being presented with this kind of cafeteria style offering of, well, here's vision A of the good life, here's vision B, here's vision C, here's vision D, and none of them are inherently better than any other, and here are some criticisms of each. And a parent might say, yeah, maybe there's a time for that, but maybe not until the child, is older. Not until the child has developed a stable sense of who they are and what their set of beliefs are that I believe are the true ones that I want to pass on to my children. So, many parents, I think, would object in practice to the kinds of things that these Rawlsian philosophers are proposing for education, and some of them would even be opposed to private schooling or homeschooling, for instance, because they think it would allow for parents to go too far in sheltering their children from diverse worldviews, which they think is essential for all children to be exposed to. So that just kind of gives you a taste for where the debate is on this. So ultimately, on this kind of Amy Gutman, Rawlsian kind of view, when push comes to shove, when there's a disagreement between parents and the state about education, it's the state that wins that disagreement. Whereas, if from the natural law tradition's perspective, and I think also from the perspective of the American legal tradition and the Constitution, the argument would be the opposite, that when push comes to shove, if there's a disagreement between parents and the state, unless what parents are doing is failing to meet a very basic minimum, literacy, numeracy, that kind of thing, then the parents should win, not the state.
Great. And a caveat before we kind of go down this line a little bit further, because I think this is so helpful and interesting. But obviously, we have. First and foremost, not representing here the official position of the Heights School on anything. This is just a teacher here having a chat with a very intelligent scholar. But also, we have parents who teach in the public school system, and so with so much respect and gratitude for all the work they're doing. But it is, I think, again, we're kind of popping up the hood and looking underneath and saying, okay, what is happening? It's interesting. Where the Heights is right here at the intersection of D.C., Maryland, Virginia. And Virginia had a very interesting gubernatorial race a couple of years ago where education was a big part of it. And there were certain things that were said during the campaigns that, it really made you wonder. It's interesting hearing more about Rawls and his philosophy and then how it's taken forward. That it's not necessarily the case that these statements that you then see in like 20-second commercials during Sunday football games about parental rights or whatever else, it's not just that they're not necessarily just kind of gaffes that shouldn't have been said. There's actually a philosophy underlying some of the statements that are made about the role of parents in schools. So they're not just kind of like innocent mistakes. I mean, there's a purpose to the things oftentimes that are said. There's thinking behind it. Maybe the mistake is saying it explicitly in a way that's not publicly palatable. But it is there is thinking and writing behind the things that are said. One aspect I'd love to hear more about is just the idea. I think that you could say, perhaps you could argue, well, what's happening now in many school systems is just kind of like public education done poorly. It is interesting. I heard you in a different context speak about something that I think is interesting to ponder, which is the idea that can you have any schooling, public, private, whatever, that's totally value neutral? Because I think that's part of the promise is like, well, we're gonna have a school that's value neutral. We're gonna present all the viewpoints, and people can just sort of choose. But is value neutrality in that way, is it actually possible? If it's not, maybe it is. If it's not, what does that then mean for the state as a state tries to educate both in and out of its public education system?
Right. So, value neutrality is just not possible. Even attempting to, just offer children a kind of cafeteria menu of, possible approaches to life, even that's not neutral, because it ends up implying a kind of relativism that, well, you could just pick and choose any of these and it's indifferent which ones you pick and choose, which is itself a kind of value system, right?
Right.
But for the most part, that's actually not what happens in schools, nor I think is what should happen, right? Because an essential part of educating children is teaching them solid values, especially at the young ages. That's more crucial in some ways than some of the academic things. So, not that the academics don't matter. Obviously, they're also very important. But values education is inherently going to be a part of any education, and it'll be implicit, even if it's not explicit. But in many cases, and even in the public schools, it's quite explicit. And the values taught are often sometimes they're values that pretty much everybody is on board with. Teaching children to be fair, to share their toys, not to bully each other, to be kind, those kinds of things. But there are other values that are more controversial, right? When you think about, people have different views about the right way to approach, questions about, say, sexuality, right? And and so schools will take a stance on that. And the question is, well, should schools be taking a controversial stance on that without allowing parents to opt their children out of those controversial lessons, for instance, right? So I think that given the impossibility of value neutrality, including on sensitive personal issues about which there is not broad societal agreement, I think that argues for the need within the public schools to the extent possible to avoid addressing things that are overly controversial, overly ideological. Some of those things just don't need to be in the curriculum at all. But then, to the extent that it is appropriate to include some of those things, I think they ought to be included in a way that's transparent, so that parents should know, we're going to have lessons about these matters, and we understand that these are controversial, and that the community has different views on these things, and then offer parents the ability to opt their children out. Or probably, I think perhaps even better, ask parents to opt their children in if they want them to be part of these more controversial lessons. But at the very least, to have the opt-out option for lessons that are more potentially ideologically controversial. I think that's a kind of minimum here. But I also think, beyond that, because the implicit values that are taught are not just taught in a particular class or a particular lesson that involves controversial subjects. The implicit values taught extend throughout the whole curriculum and the messaging of the school and what's on the billboards in the hallways and things like that. That I think the impossibility of neutrality, even on very sensitive issues about which many people disagree, I think that speaks in favor of broader school choice policies. It seems unfair that the wealthy have the ability to choose a school for their child that is in line with their values, but those who lack the means really have no alternative but to send their child to the public school, and there's a coercive element to that as well, because of course education is compulsory. So the state is, in these cases, effectively coercing parents to force their children to hear educational messages that in some cases they think are harmful to the child, because the parents really just have no feasible option or alternative apart from sending the child to the public schools. So I do think that as a basic matter of justice, maybe even as a constitutional matter, broader school choice policies, education savings accounts, vouchers, whatever mechanism you think is the best for that, are a requirement of justice, given that parents are the primary educators.
Right. Okay. Interesting. Yeah. Gosh. And it's interesting. I loved kind of the arc of your book, which sort of begins, at times, and you're talking about these stories of kids switched at birth and other sorts of things like that. And then you go into the philosophy side of things, and then all of a sudden a bunch of Supreme Court cases pop up, and it's like, okay, this is awesome. We're talking about all the things. But it's interesting, the cases that you mentioned on this topic, particularly of the parents' right to educate and the right of the state to ensure a certain minimum level of education for its citizens. It's interesting looking at the arc of the cases and kind of where they began in the 1920s. With what seemed like a pretty aggressive. I mean, if the 1920s cases happened today, there would be a lot of very livid people. We're talking about schools, state laws prohibiting schools from teaching in other languages. Or state laws prohibiting, or at least mandating public education, essentially. And it's just fascinating to read about those cases 100 years ago, and then we go, into the present. But maybe you could share some of the recent cases, and you kind of alluded to some of the issues already, but including one that just happened in Maryland. Maybe you could talk us through that one, because it's here.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so the recent Maryland case was Mahmoud v. Taylor, and it involved the Montgomery County School District in Maryland, which was, as part of the curriculum, they were reading storybooks to children, as young as pre-K or kindergarten, that involved, some fairly controversial content, which, some parents in the community were happy about or fine with, but other parents in the community were not. And there was a large group of parents that were protesting against this, including the ones who became plaintiffs to this case. And ultimately it made it, all the way up to the Supreme Court. And just this past June, the Supreme Court ruled on religious liberty grounds that the refusal of the county to allow parents to opt their children out of these lessons was a violation of the First Amendment right to religious freedom. Again, this was in the context of the public school context is coercive. Many parents have no alternative but to send their child to a public school. These are clearly not value neutral, and they're clearly, promoting very, controversial values about which there's not widespread agreement. And they're doing it at very young, impressionable ages, where, some parents, even parents who might agree with the messages being sent, might think, yeah, kindergarten, pre-K, it's a little too young to start introducing kids to these sorts of topics. Let them be innocent children for a while before they have to get into the fray of all these ideological issues. Yeah. So that's basically where the court came down on this. I think an important victory for parental rights and religious freedom that has, I think, broader implications in terms of the rights of parents to opt their children out of controversial aspects of the public school curriculum.
Is there a place for, and this is actually, well, so here, I guess here's a question. Is this exclusively a First Amendment freedom of religion issue? Or I mean, because in the beginning we were speaking to natural law and the fact that these are things that can be accessed without necessarily any reference to religion, although the beauty of, for example, John Paul II, faith and reason complementing each other, there's no contradiction here. But if I'm of a different religious persuasion, and I am just looking at the laws of nature, it seems like these rights to educate, the duty to educate one's children, it doesn't just live in a freedom of religion context. If that's the natural laws where it's coming from, I'm not sure if there's anything there. Or, I mean, are there other places where this right might live, or is that just kind of, maybe that's the obvious one and the court was trying to do something that's sort of, universally agreed to in some way?
Right. So no, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I actually wrote an amicus brief on this case that I submitted to the Supreme Court, and I wrote an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal, making the case, very much more briefly, that non-religious parents have rights too, right. And that while I think the court decided the case correctly in terms of, it's true that in this case the parents who were complaining about these lessons and wanting to opt their children out were religious, and they were making their complaints on religious grounds. So in terms of the particular case, you could defend the rights of those parents as First Amendment rights, freedom of religion rights. Part of the reason why the lawyers in the case chose to emphasize pretty much exclusively the religious freedom arguments was that this particular court has shown itself to be very friendly to religious freedom arguments. And then there's been a kind of string of cases, over the past, several years, decade or so, where the religious freedom protections have been expanding, including, related to the educational arena. So I think the lawyers strategically were being smart to emphasize that particular line of argument to get a win for their clients, right? That's what the lawyers are being paid to do. That's their job. So, so I think that all made sense tactically, and that the decision was correct constitutionally, that the First Amendment freedom of religion does protect this opt-out right for religious parents. But I think the court could have gone further and said, in addition to the fact that for these religious parents, the state's action in failing to allow these opt-outs is a violation of their right to the free exercise of religion under the First Amendment. They could have said, well, and additionally, even for non-religious parents, this action on the part of the state is a violation of the basic constitutional right of parents to direct the education and upbringing of their children. And they could have rooted that constitutionally back in those 1920s cases that you mentioned, Meyer versus Nebraska and Pierce versus Society of Sisters. And, you know, I made the argument in my brief that those cases correctly understood in the context of the common law tradition that I was talking about earlier, which itself is rooted in the natural law tradition, do provide sufficient precedent for parents having the right to opt their children out of particular classes in the public schools. I mean, the two Supreme Court cases weren't dealing with that, right? They were dealing with broader issues. The Pierce case, as you mentioned, was dealing with a law that required every child to go to the public school, and so effectively would have shut down all the private schooling options. And the court overruled that law, saying that it was contrary to parents' basic constitutional rights. But if you look at the kind of earlier precedents in the common law and in state Supreme Courts that were happening in the 19th and early 20th centuries, as public schooling was taking off and as compulsory education laws were beginning to be enacted, there was a whole string of cases in which parents wanted to exempt their children from particular aspects of these public school curricula. And usually it wasn't even controversial things. You know, sometimes it was just, look, my child, you know, needs to spend more time on these other subjects. And so I don't want the child to take, you know, the geometry class or the singing class or whatever. And there were 8 of these cases, and 7 out of 8 of these cases in the state courts, the parents won the right to be able to have their child in the public school, but opt their child out of the class that they didn't want the child to attend. And those were cases that were referred to in the 2 Supreme Court cases, Meyer and Pierce, in the 20s. So I think, you know, even on this kind of constitutional legal precedent grounds, I think the court could and should have kind of revived the Pierce line and strengthened it and clarified that it does still have bite in these contemporary cases. Unfortunately, the court didn't do that, at least in this case. I think the fact that the plaintiffs were religious, they didn't need to do that, and the court tends to prefer to argue things more narrowly rather than making broad sweeping judgments that go beyond what's required to resolve a particular case, and there are good reasons for that as well. So maybe in the future, you know, another case might come up that involves non-religious parents that requires the court to kind of revisit this issue of the constitutional rights of parents per se, even apart from the religion question. And I do hope that they do that.
That's super interesting, and we will definitely have the Wall Street Journal article and the amicus brief in the show notes for our listeners. So thanks for writing them and sharing them with us here, and we will definitely look at those. It seems like there is this, you know, on one hand, the result is one that I think is welcome to families who want more. Who want to be able to exercise that right to have authority over their children's education. I think it's so interesting that you point out. It seems like the rationale is also very important. And if it's not that there isn't a religious right to this, but is there something more as well? And if we just limit it to a religious right, what are we looking at down the road? So that's very interesting. And in this context, it's interesting to look around the world and see, okay, like, you know, Germany, wonderful country, but homeschooling is not legal there. Or I know we've got friends in Spain who, for example, there's charter schools, which for many years, decades, have operated as single-sex schools. But now in places of Spain, the government is starting to require, in order for these charter schools to continue receiving funding, that these schools become coeducational. And so it's just interesting. And some of that leads me to ask this next question: is that as we advocate for more involvement, or at least more opportunities for parents to have school choice, is there also something that we should be aware of, where, if we become too dependent on public dollars, are there any risks that we should be aware of as we kind of enter this? It's more of a policy type question, so forgive me, but I am curious. Like, should we be careful of how we fund school choice, and how we receive those that funding, either as a school or as parents?
Right. I mean, I do think there's always a danger to the extent that you become, reliant on government money for anything, right? But certainly in the educational arena, I mean, we're seeing this, at Notre Dame, right? That with the new endowment tax, all of a sudden there are all sorts of budget cuts and austerity measures and so on. Notre Dame's doing just fine, but still, it's a big chunk of change, right?
Yeah.
To have that new endowment tax, and the fact that you were kind of counting on the tax exemption there in order to be able to operate your budget, according to the usual. That does create a dependence on the government, and we see the current administration is trying to use the dependence on federal funds, as a kind of carrot or stick, depending on how you're looking at it, to try to get universities to sign on to all sorts of restrictions on their freedom to operate as they want to. So there are dangers, I think, at all levels when you become dependent on government funding. I do think that there are ways to do the school choice policies that are less dangerous. I mean, I think legislators who are concerned about this would need to write laws carefully, right, and think about and ensure that basically minimal strings are attached to the ability to receive the funding, and minimal or maybe even no strings attached, because the funding is going through parents, right? I think there are two different ways to think about school choice, and I think one way is better than the other, right? So the first way is to think about school choice as the government supporting private schools. I think the second way to think about school choice is the government assisting parents in choosing the right educational setting for their child, right? Providing them the means such that they can then use those means to choose the right educational setting, be it a private school or a public school. I think the first option, where we're kind of conceptualizing it as the government supporting the school, is a problem. Because that's where it's more likely for the government to say, well, if I'm giving this school money, my strings should come, attached to that. On conditions on the reception of the money. Whereas if you think about it, and I think it's the right way to think about it, as well, this is just recognizing that the government's role in education is subsidiary to the primary role of parents. And now we're just kind of equalizing the playing field. So once you recognize that parents are primary educators, there's not really any reason why the government-run schools should have a monopoly on public educational funding, particularly if, as the research makes clear, the government-run schools, on average, do not do a better job of preparing children academically or otherwise, even in terms of citizenship values, for law-abiding, productive citizenship as adults, which is the relevant state interest here. So, if it's the case empirically, as it is, that private schooling and even homeschooling are options that fulfill the public purpose of education, at least as well as the public schools do, then it seems just like a fundamental matter of justice that since parents are primary educators, educational funding should be funneled through parental choice to the school that parents think is best for the particular educational needs of their children. And if you think about it that way, I think it's easier to make the case that there really shouldn't be strings attached, because it's really just about putting those educational funds in the hands of parents, because the parents are the ones with the primary decision-making authority in this sphere.
Yeah, that's very, very helpful. That's an important nuance. It's helpful to think about it in that way. And boy, that's why the folks who are practicing the great art of politics, I'm happy they're doing what they're doing and thinking deeply about these questions, because those are really important. How do you do this in such a way that you preserve the freedom of the institutions going forward? That's a helpful way to think about it. Brilliant. And then maybe just, to close, I wish we could keep talking and talking. The closer, maybe more practical. I think it can be difficult to, especially in this area, which is, I think, beautifully diverse actually, in the DC area. But, we have so many friends and neighbors who are around us, and oftentimes we come at this from very different perspectives. How have you, any guidance for us as we try to engage in this, in public discourse about this issue, with friends, family, neighbors, whoever, who just believe very differently, I think, about the role of the state and about these questions, these values that many of the public schools are actively trying to pass on to our children. It's not a value judgment there, just like it's fact, it's happening. And so how do we, any guidance for us as we try to, cast a positive vision for this dynamic that you're presenting with people who really disagree with us very strongly about maybe what it means to live a good life?
Right. I mean, I think, it's hard to give very general advice there, because I think, the way conversations play out, very much depend on the context and who exactly you're talking to, what the relationship you have with that person is, and so on. So, but I do think in general, trying to find the common ground, and there almost always is something, where, so you might not agree, on, say, the substance of a particular controversial issue or something like that, but maybe, you can kind of avoid getting into that and say, okay, well, we can disagree on that, but given that we disagree, given that we're in a society where we disagree, doesn't it seem important that that parents should be able to educate their children in line with their values, right? Precisely because there's disagreement about these issues. And you might, invite them to think, well, what if the schools were requiring that all children be exposed to the opposite view, the view that you think is wrong, and maybe that I think is right? Would you want your child to be forced to learn those lessons, and not just learn those lessons as if they were one view among many, but learn those lessons as this is the truth of the matter? I think they might say, well, yeah, no, I wouldn't want my child to be forced to learn those lessons that I seriously disagree with, that I think are wrong. And maybe that might help them to then see and sympathize, right? And say, oh, okay, well, I can see why, even if I disagree with you kind of on the merits of the issue, it might make sense to allow kind of for broader opt-outs, right? Or broader mechanisms where parents aren't forced to expose their children to values that they disagree with. Or sometimes even just to go back to like very basic cases, what do you think about ancient Sparta? What do you think about taking kids away from their parents at age 7 to be educated in common by the state? What do you think about, Lois Lowry's The Giver and just, reassigning kids away from their biological parents to whoever the state deems worthy? Well, you probably dislike that, right? Well, why? And then that same principle should lead us to recognize the problems with a view of education in which the state is ultimately in charge rather than the parents, because it's the same underlying principle that's at work, right, in all of these things. It's more extreme, of course, in the example of Sparta or The Giver, but the fundamental principle that the state is ultimately in charge rather than the parents remains the same. And so maybe, that can also be a way to make the argument to go from a case where they are going to agree with you and say, well, look, this same logic applies in this other case. And so if you disagree with it in the first case, you should also disagree with it in the second case. So, those are maybe some strategies, but like I said, it's really going to depend on the individual context.
I love that. That's so helpful, though. Yeah, that's great. And there is so much in common. I mean, at the end of the day, you might be having this conversation with somebody who you disagree with, but you're both like walking your kids or playing in the yard or, having the pint at the pub. I mean, it's so much in common. Melissa, feel free to say no. I do have one more question, but if you've got to go, please don't hesitate to pull the ejection cord. Okay. Last question. I spent more time in the book about parental authority. Again, To Whom Do Children Belong? You've just published Ethics, Politics, and Natural Law, Principles for Human Flourishing. High accolades from, among others, Professor Robert George. This book represents the clearest, most readable exposition and defense of contemporary natural law theory yet to appear. That is high praise. So first off, congratulations.
Thank you.
I know a great deal has been written about natural law in the past. What prompted the desire, or what need did you see that brought this book about? I can't wait to read it cover to cover deeply. But what elicited it from you and from your career and your work?
Yeah, for me, it was really my students. I've been teaching ethics courses, for over a decade, and I always teach my students natural law theory, together with competing views, and I'd always struggled to find readings that I could give them that were accessible to them, that were both philosophically rigorous, but also that I could expect them to be able to understand, right? Mm-hmm. And so. That was really the motivation for the book. That I thought, I do think this is true, right? That this view of ethics is right. That it is in some sense a common sense view, such that it should be explainable. It should be something that is accessible to a broad range of people. But it was difficult to find materials that I could give to my students. That they could access, right? And so I really wrote the book largely with that in mind. Something that it's not an easy read, right? I'm not going to say it's like light, beach reading kind of book, but I do think it's a book that tries to avoid jargon. It tries to make the case relatively free from too much academic back and forth. I put all that in the footnotes. To the extent possible, so that the main text, you can just follow the argument. And, it's philosophically rigorous, so it's not easy. But it is something that I think with a careful reading, is something that I can give to students, and is something that somebody who's not an expert in the field can read and benefit from. And that was really the main motivation.
Beautiful. Well, I've perused. I read the other one in detail, but really looking forward to a careful read, because it's all these different concentric circles that circle around what we do here at the school, which is essentially we're just a community of parents and teachers trying to do what's right for our boys. And so I think these books are critical, because they help us understand why we do what we do, and they also help us do a better job of ensuring that these rights continue, because you look around the world and they're not present everywhere. So we're tremendously blessed, and the task ahead of us is, it is what it is. And so great tools in executing that task. So brilliant. Well, thank you so much for your writing. We'll have all this in the show notes, and grateful for your thought as well. Thank you for spending some time with us. It's been great to chat with you. But thank you, Melissa, very, very much.
No, it was my pleasure. Thank you.
That's it for this week, folks. Thank you so much for listening. Our thanks once again to Dr. Melissa Moschella of the University of Notre Dame for her time. and her scholarship on this incredibly important topic. To learn more about her, visit heightsforum.org. Click on the show notes for this episode, and you'll find links to her bio at Notre Dame. You'll also find links to her books, to the amicus brief that she wrote, the Wall Street Journal editorial that she mentioned, a whole lot of other good things there as well. So definitely, this is an important topic. I love the podcast medium because it's not the point here to kind of exhaust the topics that we discuss, but just to sort of, whet the appetite and offer an on-ramp to some really important, interesting questions. So that was very much accomplished, I think, and deeply, deeply grateful to Dr. Moschella, again, not only for her time, but for her scholarship on this really important topic. To support the work of the Heights School, as we do our best to support parents as primary educators, do consider supporting the Heights Forum. Visit heightsforum.org. Click on support. Everything you do is incredibly, incredibly appreciated. Very, very helpful. While you're there, you can also learn more about the upcoming Convivium Conference, which is sold out. But in addition to that, the Art of Teaching Boys conferences. There's two of them, one in January, one in May. We would love to see you there. This is for men and women who are interested in learning more about how to form boys in the classroom. We would love to see you there. In addition, the Fathers Conference coming up November 1 here on campus at the Heights for Fathers of the Heights and friends of yours beyond the wall. You are very, very welcome. Learn more at heightsforum.org or heights.edu. A lot going on. Thanks for listening to all of it. Of course, on top of all of this, our Substack with the headmaster. Good things happen at the Heights. Thanks to the incredible team here doing all the things that they do. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next week.